friend. It's been a while. My assistant Watari has informed me why you've come to me today.
Yes, I wanted to get your thoughts on the Squid Game situation.
Oh, you mean the unverified rumor of what they're calling Squid Game? Yes, that has been trending online this week, and the mystery surrounding it has seemingly resulted in the disappearance of about 441 South Korean persona non gratas. As well as, most crucially, the disappearance of South Korean police officer Hwang Junho, who called his superior earlier this week after his initial disappearance, describing the island and a group of rich masked men, making the desperate play extremely easy children's playground games, with the consequence of murder if they fail them.
Yeah, MB, how do you think an idea like that could have come about?
Well, the idea itself is pretty basic. It draws pretty much from a dumb movie you might have heard of called The Hunger Games, which itself was a ripoff of an even better, yet less relative movie called Battle Royale. There was also a fairly popular anime that never made it out of Japan called Gambling Apocalypse Kaiji, which has an extremely similar premise to what I'm seeing being described here.
Yeah, but those were just movies. How could they put something like that together?
Well, I do have some notions on how a situation like that could have occurred, and they're pretty interesting. Have you ever heard of a facility called The Village?
Should I have?
Well, maybe not. Alright then, time for a history lesson in international espionage. Our story starts in the year 1960, the height of the Cold War, the spy versus spy era. Having seen the liabilities of M16's 00 series and their relatively high body counts, higher-ups at NATO created their own secret agent program based on the British model, with the only main difference being NATO's policy of sending its secret agents unarmed instead of licensing them to kill anyone who got in their way. Through this process, a nameless singular agent rose through the ranks, codenamed John Drake, sometimes known to the public as the Danger Man, whose exploits were well enough reported that they went on to later inspire a ridiculous and unrelated cartoon called Danger Mouse. He goes on to complete 4 tours of duty and 86 successful missions, 0 fatalities. But something changes on the day of September 29, 1967. An event occurs that pushes John Drake too far. This event is an absolute top secret, and whatever it is never known to anyone. But as a result of this event, he can no longer perform his job, and therefore he can no longer meet the requirements of being a secret agent. He loses his temper, he resigns from the one job he can't actually resign from, and upon returning to his flat in London, he is immediately gassed with drugs and taken to the Village, where he awakens in a lodging that is a close approximation of his original London apartment, only replicated on this island prison. Which brings us to the Village, a state-of-the-art island resort prison for people who know too much and can't be trusted to keep it to themselves. Its location is classified, but it was speculated to exist on an unregistered island off the coast of Lithuania. These days, most people don't bring up the Village as much as they used to back in the old days, but you might have seen it parodied in The Simpsons or on an episode of Pinky and the Brain. But in the 1960s, it was running at full capacity. Now, whereas a typical prison has the objective of reforming its prisoners to reintegrate them into society, the Village had no such objectives because it knew its prisoners were simply too dangerous to ever be released, for they would tell what they knew. Therefore, it was based around the unique concept of breaking them and filing them away to never be seen again. Between its psychedelic and labyrinthian architecture, its Disneyland-esque atmosphere, where all the people are fake and wearing fake smiles, it had no qualms about destroying the people inside of it, where it submitted them to 24-hour surveillance, regular druggings with every drug that was popular in the 1960s, the occasional hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and pretty much every type of physical and psychological torture you can imagine. On top of that, the Village was the first facility to employ the infamous number system, where people were removed of their names and just lived as numbers.
Yeah, that part sounds extremely similar to the data we have on the Squid Game.
So in the Village, John Drake became known as Number 6, and the Village was overseen by a person named Number 2. Number 2 was a revolving authoritarian figure played by various high-ranking British government officials and the occasional character actor just to keep it interesting. Now, it's unknown who was running the Village. The high population of British staff seems to lead toward it being an unethical, top-secret, internally British operation. Although Number 6, who was British himself, was extremely paranoid for months that it was an elaborate facade created by the former Soviet Union, which may or may not have been intentionally played out to annoy him. As far as we know, Number 6 was the only real prisoner in the village, despite the fact that several others claimed to also be prisoners. However, the sad truth was that potentially every other number in the village was potentially an actor simply trying to further break Number 6 and screw with his mind. Occasionally, former co-workers from his Danger Man days would stop by to visit him and further fuck with his mind, and lend to the validity of whatever machination the current Number 2 was up to at the time.
So, if the island was ruled by Number 2, then who was Number 1?
Why yes, that was the big driving question, wasn't it? The presence of a Number 2 in a position of ultimate power really points towards the existence of a Number 1, plus the additional confirmed fact that we know Number 2 had some superior and was taking phone orders from someone on the other end. Especially given the fact that the Number 2 could be switched out against his will or even in the event of his personal failure, and was switched out on the regular to keep Number 6 disoriented and maintain the status quo of the village.
So what happened to Number 6?
Ultimately, Number 6's fate is inconclusive. We have records that for about 17 months he was subjected to a wide variety of tortures, but it is unclear the order in which these records followed. It also gets extremely murky towards the end of things, and that is where it becomes up to interpretation. Now, I myself, based on the evidence that I have, do think he had a full psychotic break and was no longer a threat to the higher-ups of the village. Therefore, the village continued operating for about 20 years until it was finally decommissioned and destroyed in the early 1980s. Hence how the story became public knowledge, albeit knowledge of low importance. There was a ghastly and factually incorrect TV series made out of it in the early 2000s with Ian McKellen, and it also inspired the show Lost, and they even loosely based that sappy movie The Truman Show around the general concept of a constant surveillance island, albeit one heavily sanitized for a family-friendly audience.
Now, based on Junho's evidence, the Squid Game started operating in 1988.
Well, now that would line up extremely well with the decommissioning of the village. Now, the druggings, the abductions, the psychedelic disorienting architecture, and the island facility with the central control room. On top of that, the face man serving the same role as Number 2, these are all literally aspects taken straight out of the village. So it's not hard to think that a man with enough wealth and status to know about what occurred on the village could have taken the blueprints from it and easily repurposed it. Now, the fact of the matter is that South Korea is surrounded by hundreds of small, uninhabited, rocky islands, some of which are the topic of international scandals every once in a while. It would be simple for a wealthy individual to acquisition one of these islands, especially since South Korea's government has gone through several eras in the past decades where the law has always been a bit loose and there has been plenty of oversight. Though there is also the number system to consider. Since the Squid Game is using a number system like the village, it is safe to say that the big driving question of who is Number 1 would still apply to the Squid Game as it did in the village, even if that question isn't being spoken out loud anymore. Now, based on the evidence we currently have, the identity of the new Number 1, the operator of the Squid Game, can be narrowed down pretty concisely. It's obviously that the operator of the Squid Game has to be someone of extreme wealth and status in South Korea, noting that all involved parties are Korean, and like it or not, Korea is the only country in the world that speaks Korean. Therefore, that creates an extra step in the process for anyone who is not natively Korean. There is the possibility that it could be someone from outside of Korea with a fondness for the country, but that is extremely unlikely due to the highly personal nature of which the games seem to be centered around. The games described are just basic Korean children's games, although a few of them are more internationally understood than others. This leads again to evidence that this is something deeply personal, stemming from a person who either hated their childhood or deeply, deeply loved it. But otherwise, the concepts of a high-stakes life and death game are mostly taken from the manga Kaiji, especially that one with the bridge. That one is very much blatant plagiarism. Now, Kaiji originally came out in the mid-90s, but it never really became popular at all with Western audiences. So that again points to someone who is very much familiar with Asian, Korean, Japanese media. It also had a very popular film series about 10 years ago, which ultimately points to the Squid Game creator being a very rich Korean anime fan, at least above the age of 40, possibly even as old as 50. Now, I wonder if the number one in the village and the number one in the Squid Game could possibly be the same person. Now, if that were the case, this would also point to a much older person. It's not a complete impossibility, though, if there were multiple number ones in the same way that there were multiple number twos. Nevertheless, the general class disparity in which the rich kill the poor despite being viewed as a sort of last chance or mercy, this idea can easily be compared to the Hunger Games, but it's still just ultimately class warfare, which is a real problem. And quite frankly, very timely, more timely than ever as we live in the age of Amazon. I suppose it is also a fresh idea that these people would be desperate enough to come so willingly. And that is just more or less referential to the cruel reality of everyday capitalism.
So what do you think is going to happen now?
Unfortunately, the public knowledge of the Squid Game is growing out of control by the day. Even if the general public currently thinks this is just a rumor, the story behind it is unfortunately too fantastic, too relatable, and ultimately too tantalizing. So copycat games, albeit with less dire circumstances, are popping up around the globe. Honestly, considering the state of things these days and how well the idea is being received online, I'm surprised there aren't more people trying to legalize it. I think the big point of contention going forward is going to be whether or not Hwang Junho can be found alive or not. Now, at this point, there's definitely a search team looking for him, but right now I cannot predict whether or not he'll be found alive. If he is found alive, though, with his direct knowledge of the island's location, a proper prosecution and investigation of the organizers could begin. Otherwise, all we can do right now is monitor the island surrounding Korea for any irregularities or clues. Without a direction, the games could probably run indefinitely, barring a collapse of its control systems or some other disaster putting a stop to it. Does that answer all your questions?
Yes, I think that's about everything.
Alright then, well, it was good talking to you today. I hope to hear again from you soon.
Hey guys, Actual Human MB here, trying something different for a change. Last weekend, I watched Squid Game, and goddamn, it was like the best Korean drama I've ever seen. Like, seriously, they've not perfected it before now. Now, I was originally just going to do a normal review of Squid Game in my usual style, but the whole time I was watching it, it just kept deeply reminding me of The Prisoner. At first, I was just going to do a review video where, like, I compared it to The Prisoner, or explained how it could technically work as a sequel to it. But I saw a bunch of other people doing dumb shit like that, and I just wanted to make something way more highbrow. Now, making an in-universe video was very tricky, but it does work if you assume Junho managed to get his evidence out before he was shot. Now, I realize this is a hard break from my typical format lately, but I used to do videos more like this normally in college, so did you guys like this? If so, I have an even more screwed up one based around the movie Big Hero 6. Special thanks to my actor friend Nick Berg for answering the other end of this call. Anyway, please like and subscribe. I'll be back later. Bye.